10-minute walk of a green space. And that's an aspiration that that the UK government is seeking to have with as part of its new environmental improvement plan. That in itself would mean that humans, as well as our developments, are likely to come into close contact with aspects of ecology. And those of you who may be aware, we're not too far away from the 1st of March. And of course, 1st of March is the start of meteorological spring, which means we're going to have chirping birds, nesting birds, seagulls, pigeons, great crested newts, and all sorts of wonderful creatures of God running around the fields that we want to build on. And potentially, if we don't know what good ecology is, we could find ourselves in significant trouble. And so it is with great pleasure that we do have Joshua Stratford, who is a principal ecologist for SWECO UK, who has very kindly agreed to give a 1-hour presentation to us about the importance of ecology, and of course the bats and the bees and the birds and everything else that goes in the ground that we come across happily during construction. So how's that for a build-up, Joshua?
I'm grateful. I'm very impressed as well. You've got your timings right, and you're aware of the dawn of spring coming, and the newts waking up and the birds just starting.
Right. Well, then I think that then leads us to for your presentation. So for the purposes of everyone on this call, could I please ask that we mute our mics? Questions can be taken at the end. Obviously use the chat to raise your questions, and between myself and Joshua, I think we'll try and get everyone on board. The meeting has been recorded, and the presentation slides, they can be offered to those who attended. Is that correct, Joshua?
Yeah, that's fine. I've got all my notes in it as well, so you'll be able to see that.
Okay, good. Right, so please, could everyone mute their mics, and Joshua, over to you. You're leading the show here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, greetings all, and thank you for having me. After that fantastic introduction, there's not really much more to say. I've been a practicing ecologist now for about 12 years, and I'm a full member of the Royal Society of Biology, which is one of the institutes that represents ecologists. So we're going to jump on to our first slide. So I've sort of set an agenda. What is ecology and where does it fit within construction? Policy and legislation. And then we're going to spread into obviously species and habitats and how that policy and legislation impacts those. What does it mean for you guys as engineers? And then some case studies and personal experiences that I have had dealt with. So what is ecology and where does it fit into developments? Well, ecology is defined as the study of organisms and how they interact with their sort of physical environment, and those how they interact with the biotic and abiotic factors. Now, biotic factors are living components of an ecosystem. So they are the other species, they're the trees, they're the vegetation and the habitats that the animals live in. And the abiotic factors are non-living factors, such as chemical and physical factors, which affect ecology. Now, you may think that with ecology, if we're developing something, we're really only impacting the biotic factors. We're removing habitat for them or for a species to occupy, and we're removing sort of foraging for that species. But it's becoming more and more important to assess the impacts of abiotic factors, which include things like air quality. So obviously Epping has a big issue around there with nitrogen deposition. So we're now assessing things like this. And obviously Norfolk has recently, as of last year, has a big nutrient neutrality requirement. So all developments must be achieving a net neutrality in their nitrates and phosphates. So it encompasses a lot of fields that are outside of ecology, and we often have to rely on other specialists to provide this. So where do we kind of fit in? Well, usually ecologists are the first people on site. We establish the scale of any protected species conflicts, how many species are present, what and where they are, can we retain those areas? And the important part now is that we also establish the site as a value for the biodiversity net gain. So we use the new UK HABS methodology, which values a site based on the habitat's distinctiveness, which is how rare it is, and then the condition of that habitat, which then get multiplied together with a few other factors to value and give it a score. And it's kind of a new way moving forward that is being sort of imparted on developers to achieve a sort of a 10% net gain. And in some cases, it could be even more than that. Now, depending on what's present on site, we may be undertaking additional surveys and potentially translocations, which means that we can run into sort of the early development stage and the site preparation phases, where we can sometimes overlap with earthworks and things like that. So obviously, because we're moving animals out of areas, or as in more cases than not, we're sort of supervising demolition or a soft strip of a building, we can sort of be present during those stages. And very rarely, ecology features can move onto site during construction, and that's when we get called out to deal with them. Last year, towards the sort of the tail end of the breeding season, we got called out to a large resi developer who had been building their houses, and they'd left the windows open over a bank holiday weekend, and some swallows had moved in 3 days and constructed a nest in one of the eaves. Slap bang during construction. So we had to devise a means that would allow them to continue to work whilst still protecting the nest of the species. So we're going to come on now to policy and legislation. It's thrilling, I assure you. So these are the sort of the main things that govern sort of UK law. We have some of the best environmental law in the world, and these provide protection to a number of species. So we obviously have the NPPF, which was revised in 2021, the Environment Bill, which is backdated from about 2019, brought in 2020, and then it should be fully implemented by the end of this year. But I think there are still things that are being pushed back into next year and maybe even the year after. We have the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act of 2006. I'll go on to these in greater detail, but those are the sort of the three planning policy-based pieces. So that they impart requirements upon local government to do things, whereas the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Countryside Rights of Way Act, the Conservation of Habitat Species Regulations, and the Protection of Badgers Act are the legal aspects that afford protection to species and then force us to be sort of careful of whatever we do. So the NPPF, the main goal of this is to promote the conservation and restoration and enhancement of priority habitats, ecological networks, and the recovery of priority species. So these nice bold words that I've highlighted here, these appear again and again through various different iterations of documents. But they're the key parts because they highlight that the priority species are the ones that we really need to be concerned of, and they have the highest value. The priority habitats are those under the NPPF, but equally under the UK HABS metric that are scored the highest. So impacting those makes it very difficult for you to offset your development. The NPPF also forces developers to identify options for securing and measuring net gains for biodiversity. Obviously, this came out a little before because the early versions came out a little before the UK HABs, but this was one of the main means of enforcing that the Environment Bill. In between the Environment Bill, it was one of the main ways of enforcing that the net gain was delivered. So now we actually have the big bad Environment Bill. Now this enshrines net gain into law. There are sort of 7 key messages that sort of come with this that, so net gain is going to be a part of law. Developers will be required to offset the loss of natural habitat within their development, and they'll need to achieve a net gain value of at least 10%. Now, one thing to be careful of is that there are certain councils and certain boroughs that demand over 10%. So Guildford is an example where they demand 20% net gain, which can be very difficult if you don't actually have a very big site. The second point is that net gain applies to all EIA schemes. Third point is that, yes, you need to achieve 10%, and that you need to submit a plan of how you're going to sort of go about doing that. And that then leads on to the fourth point, is that this plan needs to be maintained for 30 years. So whereas initially under a lot of landscape planning, we were recommending like 5-year management plans, this now needs that the habitats themselves need to sometimes be maintained for in addition to 30 years. Things like ancient woodland can take, or sort of things like mature woodland can take up to sort of 38 years to reach those criteria that you may be applying them to be. And other things like ancient woodland are completely irreplaceable, so you can't even offset those. There are a few project examples here that will be considered exempt. Nationally infrastructure projects, in some cases, are considered exempt. Works on protected sites or irreplaceable habitats to improve them are generally considered exempt. There are some small developments that do not require EIA that will be exempt. That is currently, I believe, set at under 10 houses, but the site has to be under half a hectare. And that's quite recent guidance to come out. And then obviously there's some targeting of brownfield land allows you to sort of avoid it. Now the developer obviously.
Joshua, what's irreplaceable habitats?
So irreplaceable habitats are habitats under the biodiversity metric that are deemed so valuable that you cannot offset them. So they are things like ancient woodland, which take hundreds of years to develop, and that the loss couldn't really be mitigated for. There's nothing you can do to recreate something that takes 200-300 years to create. It also includes some very rare acidic grasslands, and where in the case you end up having to do these, you then have to just sort of apply an IROPI process. So we ourselves had a special case of acidic grassland at one of our developments where we had a really rare fungal array that was uniquely sort of combined with the acidic grassland. And the offsetting we ended up having to do for that resulted in a scheme that was about sort of, I think we were about 10 hectares in size, of which about 1.5 hectares of this grassland. Ultimately, I think we ended up having to spend about 1.5 million and buy something akin to about 10 times the value of habitat that was lost, and go through the process of stripping all of the soil, transferring that over just to make sure that we were doing everything we could to sort of ensure that essentially the habitat was maintained as best we could.
Thank you.
With the clear IROPI case to demonstrate that there was overriding reasons of public interest. But we'll come on to that as well a bit later. Yeah. So then we have the NERC Act. Again, this is a little bit of planning policy, but it's kind of relevant because it's a very uniquely worded act. It means that every public authority in its exercising functions must have a regard for biodiversity. So they have to take it into account. Now, this is where you can sometimes fall afoul of it, because if you're working for a government body, so that's the MOD, highways, water, air, electricity, and you're undertaking works that affect a NERC species, they are required to offset that impact. Whereas under development, the NERC would be implemented through planning policy. And so the planners would have reviewed an ecology report and they would comment on whether or not they think mitigation is needed and certain things like that. When you're working under, so obviously, like the permitted developments, because there is no planning, there's no oversight on it, this is where clients should be aware that there are requirements under the NERC Act that they undertake various mitigations. So on to the biggest one, which is the Wildlife and Countryside Act. There are 9 schedules to it, of which only 4 are really relevant. So you have Schedule 1, which lists special birds and all nesting birds. So under Schedule 1, all nesting birds are protected, irregardless of what it is. Feral pigeons, ringneck parakeets, which are a Schedule 9 species, all the way up to big things like golden eagles. So all nesting birds are protected, but some species are protected further, and that is the Schedule 1 species individually. So they have a list of Schedule 1 species, which are golden eagle, and they are protected not only against death, destruction of nests, they're protected against disturbance. So this makes it an offence to disturb the bird. Whereas under the Act, it's essentially an offence to intentionally kill, injure, or take any wild bird or damage or destroy the nests. So obviously that Schedule 1 aspect, where the disturbance, or where they're sort of protected against disturbance, that can have a lot of impacts, because the wording specifically means that that any action you're undertaking could be, or that could act as a disturbance, could be done recklessly, and therefore you would be potentially responsible for that. So Schedule 5, this applies to animals which are protected. They're protected against intentionally killing, and again, recklessly injuring. And of sale, but they're not protected against taking. So this covers things like amphibians, bats, reptiles, and grey-crested newts, but a lot of these will be covered by other aspects of law as well. We have Schedule 8, which is protected plant species. So these are protected against uprooting, cutting, picking, and essentially damaging, which can be problematic, but they're really actually quite rare and quite unique to certain habitats. I have got a story to talk about on that one. And then we have the Schedule 9 species, which are the horribly invasive ones, the Japanese knotweeds, the Virginia creeper, the giant hogweed, that shouldn't be here. They've been released by accident and they've grown along in the wild. And this is the one where if you are found to be growing it or allowing it to spread, you can be responsible and legally held responsible for that. Now, a bit of a funny one is the Countryside Rights of Way Act of 2000. So it affords protection to footpaths and bridleways, but the more important aspect of it is that it affords, through Schedule 9, further protections to triple SIs. So there is, for each triple SI, there is a list of actions that are notifiable to Natural England. Now, these are things like, it'll be a big long list, and it'll say things like any breaking ground, any digging or cutting, or any waterworks. And this is quite important, because if you are doing any of those works within a triple SI, you need to get confirmation from Natural England, and they do a thing called a CROW assessment, whereas they look at the impacts you're going to be undertaking, and then assess whether or not you're going to have any effect. Now, the other thing the CROW Act did is enhance the penalties for those found damaging or destroying triple SIs, making it a lot more stricter, and importantly, it introduced a new offence whereby third parties can be convicted of damaging triple SIs. And there have been a few cases where landfills and, let's say, rubbish dumps or building merchants have been found responsible for runoff that has travelled into triple SIs. One left. Well, after this one left. We've got the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations Assessment. This is the big one for international and European protected species. So this affords protection to SPAs, which are Special Protected Areas, SACs, Special Areas of Conservation, and Ramsar sites. It also offers protection to potential sites, which are sites that support designated features of the above ones, but that are yet to be defined. So they're a very specific set. When Natural England thinks they're going to define whether or not they're going to make it a triple SI, those sites are listed on Magic, and you can search for them to make sure that you're not working in them or you're working on them. Because if you're working in them, around them, or near them, you can be potentially having an impact, and you really need a HabRegs assessment to have taken place. And then it also affords certain protection to certain species, newts, bats, otters that require licenses to undertake works, and those licenses allow you to undertake an action that would otherwise be considered unlawful. Then finally, we have the Protection of the Badgers Act. It is a very badly worded act that was originally implemented to prevent blood sports. It prohibits the killing, taking, injuring, selling, and possession of a badger, which is unlikely to affect us. But the bit that sort of does impact us is it prohibits the ill treatment of any badger, the damage, destruction, or disturbance of a set, or causing a dog to enter a set. And these are the parts that sort of affect the construction industry, because whilst we don't intend to be causing any impacts, it's the disturbance of a set whilst badgers are present that therefore we can be causing or fall afoul of this law. And hence the reason that if we're undertaking works where we've got badgers present, we will look to close down a set, fit one-way gates to prevent them from re-accessing areas. But that all needs to be done under a license. So we'll just jump into protected species. So we've spoken about the legislation. I'm just going to run through the individual species at the moment, what we need to be thinking about, and how we sort of the seasons that they're active. So first off, we've got nesting birds. It's not just nesting birds though; it's all birds. So the nesting season is obviously considered to be March to August excluded. But there are some species that breed all year round. Feral pigeon, a lot of the columbiformes, so doves, pigeons, they will attempt to breed all year round, but some species like barn owls can also breed all year round if they have adequate food. Now, the annoying part of that is that if you've got feral pigeons in a building, those nests are protected whilst they're nesting, and they can breed all year round. So it can cause delays, and obviously we try and keep an eye on these types of things, exclude them from areas. And so if you're working in environments where you potentially outside of the season, but you can foresee there might be problems, it's good to raise this with the client. At the moment, we're doing a lot of bridge work, and it's fantastic for pigeons and seagulls to nest under bridges. So we've already spoken about installing spike strips and other deterrent measures to prevent us and allow us to continue working into the breeding season, because we're preventing them from nesting. Now, the other part about birds is you can have special protected areas. They're all designated, so all SPAs are designated just for birds. And they can include non-breeding species, so wintering birds, and passage species. And the very presence of those species is why the area is designated an SPA. In Essex, we have Fowl Nests SPA, which is designated a lot for Brent geese. And the problem with the Brent geese is they like to move inland, and they'll feed on crops. Now, if those Brent geese are in significant numbers, they are afforded a protection by the SPA, because the numbers are so significant. If you were to impact the geese in the field, you would impact the numbers of the SPA. And that's why you'll need a habitat regulations assessment, or HRA, to sort of cover that. Now, obviously, as I mentioned before, all Schedule 1 species are afforded further protection. Now, that importantly doesn't just apply to when they've got a nest, but it's the part before, when they're establishing a nest, and the part once all of their young could still be dependent on the nest. So in some cases, whereas the average sort of passerine can sort of be done, sort of have built the nest within sort of 5 to 6 days, to be incubated and have successfully fledged the chicks within around a 30-day window, Schedule 1 species are afforded the protection from the moment they start singing in an area all the way through to when those chicks have full on left the area. We'll move on to our next favorite, badgers. So badgers are protected, as we said, against disturbance to their sets whilst they're in occupation. So a big part of our work is identifying whether or not the sets are actually in use. If a set isn't in use, it isn't afforded protection. So it's one of the key things. And badgers generally act very transient in that they can have a set or outlier sets where they maybe visit it once every couple of weeks, whereas a main set is one that they're in use constantly. Now, one of the points to note down about badges is that we can only close down sets July to November. It's the only period a license allows us to do it. And that's primarily because during that, it's the only period post breeding. So the badgers have all had their pups, they've all been raised, and they sort of go off a bit. And then they'll start breeding over winter, sort of towards December time, and then they'll have pups, and the sows will be pregnant sort of January onwards, and they'll hatch around March time. So the license window allows you to do it at a period when it's least likely to impact badgers. Now, badgers are generally active all year round, but they tend to slow down over winter. They go into a semi-torpid state, so they're not as active. But one of the issues with badgers is that they are, in the summer, they can be highly mobile. Now, one of the things I would just sort of say is that I've had a couple of sites where spoil piles have been left to grow a little nice and vegetated, only to find that a badger has moved into them. So it is a risk, and obviously we would recommend, particularly during sort of March onwards, you think about if you've got a site, if you've certainly got them near you, consider fencing them off the areas to stop them accessing it, because they will look for most places they can to potentially move in. So next we'll talk about amphibians. We've got our lovely grey-crested newt here, but it does also include 3 other species of amphibians. So we have grey-crested newt, natterjack toad, and bullfrog. These are all European protected species, so they're all afforded significant protection. They need a license to do anything with. Nearly all of the amphibians hibernate over winter. The overwinter period is sort of October to March. It's weather depending. If we get above 5 degrees consistently, they'll come out. So they can be out in Feb, and they can be out in sort of November. But realistically, any cold ones, it sort of knocks them back and they go back in to sort of hibernation. Now they tend to breed in ponds from sort of March to May. They leave they then leave into sort of terrestrial habitats. And unfortunately for grey-crested newts, at least, they're not very smart. They often just disperse straight outwards. There's no real strategy to it, which means that if you've got a pond near a development, they will just walk straight across your construction sites. Which is why we often put in things like fencing to deter them if we know that they're present. But equally, they will also quite happily inhabit spoil piles, rubble mounds. They love that type of thing when they're in their sort of terrestrial phase. Now, you get this sort of release at the end of May as the adults all leave, and then you'll get another release sort of August time as all the juveniles that have hatched. They go through a life stage as an eft. They grow additional legs and lose the gills, and then they are able to sort of leave the water and they'll enter the terrestrial phase. Any late juveniles, though, that's the sort of laid in late May, those eggs will hatch and those juveniles will stay in the pond until the next year. Now, a license is needed if you're going to do any works that may impact a pond or a place or a resting place. And we'd often recommend that you have an ecal present and a precautionary method statement if you think you're going to be working near anything like this. But there is obviously, for newts at least, there's been great sort of leaps and bounds with the district level license, which allows you to sort of pay a fee to Natural England, and Natural England in turn funds newt population management on sort of a county scale. As the approach with the traditional licensing often led to developers putting in ponds on sites. So you were creating small populations, but they weren't necessarily joining a wider, larger population. So the district level license is designed to manage newts on sort of a county scale and improve where there are already lots of populations and look to sort of enhance it further from that. So then we move on to our lizards. So, well, our reptiles. We have common lizard, grass snake, slow worm, and adder, which are sort of our 4 main ones. They're protected against death, destruction, injuring. But then we also have, in addition to that, smooth snake and sand lizard, which are afforded European protected and they need a license to do anything that may impact those. Now, reptiles, again, like most things, are active March to October. They hibernate over winter, and sometimes they can be earlier. They need temperatures to be above 10 degrees C. 2021 was the first year that adders have been recorded active all year round, which is potentially a sort of signs of climate change. And we may find that moving forward that reptiles are becoming more active and more prevalent throughout the periods. They inhabit sort of a grass and scrub mixture of habitats, and they'll hibernate in the root networks of trees. But equally, they will like to hibernate in rubble piles, spoil mounds, and sort of large features that they can sort of dig into and dig under, which means that you could be impacting them if you're working in any terrestrial habitat, especially over winter, as sort of during the summer they'll move out the way with some vegetation clearance, whereas in the winter they're hibernating underground, and that can cause problems if we're sort of digging around then. So we've got water voles and otters. They don't really hibernate, but they go into torpor over winter and sort of emerge February, March time. And then they can be found in ditches, rivers, streams. They burrow into the banks. The water voles, the otters burrow in and create massive holts. And there are terrestrial populations of water vole in Scotland, so they don't need water. So you need to sort of think about these species if you're working on sort of banks, bridges, or any reprofiling schemes. They're afforded full protection from killing, injuring, and disturbance whilst in their places of shelter, and the sort of the holts and burrows are all protected against damaging and destruction as well. So if you're going to be impacting those, you need a license, and sometimes in some sites, if you're reprofiling an entire network of ditches, we often need to translocate them. Then we have dormice. These are lovely little ginger fuzzy balls of joy. They hibernate completely over the winter in these massive big balls of vegetation that they sort of pile together and weave. You find them at the base of trees. And then they sort of emerge sort of around March, and they'll be active all the way through to about October, when they sort of feed up and then go back into their sleep. Now, they're heavily reliant on hedgerows and woodlands. So any impacts or any works that may impact those could significantly impact the survivability of them. And a license is needed if you're going to be doing anything that will be in sort of changing those habitats where we know that they're present. Finally, we're on to sort of bats. This is a lovely brown long-eared bat coming out of a roost at night. They hibernate over winter, November to sort of February. They generally breed sort of June to August. So whilst they're active from March through to sort of October, the main breeding season is June through to August, where they'll have a single pup, and basically it clings on to them for that entire period before towards the end of the year, when it sort of begins to forage and hunt for itself. And which is why for ecologists the June to August window is so important for our surveys, because that's when we can find out if your building is a maternity colony. Now, the protection is afforded based upon what type of roost it is. So maternity colonies where bats have babies are generally considered one of the most important sites, alongside hibernation roosts, which are often caves, or in some sort of coastal areas it can be old coastal forts or pillboxes, where they need a cold building with a stable temperature. Whereas for maternity, they're like a warm building where they can use a lot of well, they have to keep it about sort of 35 degrees. So but equally, any bat roost is considered protected under the law, and you need a license to demolish it. But they're also protecting commuting features, so hedgerows, habitat that is of importance to foraging bats. So it's important to think about lighting during temporary works or the actual development. We'll often recommend that there's a lighting plan in place to make sure you don't accidentally illuminate some of these features, or to make sure that we're not impacting commuting routes. And you can also get some special areas of conservation that are designated for bats, in which case there'll be some more stringent measures required about what hedgerows can be taken out of. And that's usually something an ecologist should pick up and will come under the sort of the zones of influence. Now, without pictures, I'm afraid, but just a little summary of sort of the other species we encounter. Obviously, we've got invertebrates. There are 3 species of invertebrate that are European protected species, and 312 other species that are considered protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Again, they're very rare and very niche. You're unlikely to encounter them in some areas. However, things like stag beetles do come up around London. They're present in the area. They're like big rotted old woodlands and sort of mature trees and vegetation. So you do find them in London in these little pockets of green where they've been present for a considerable time. We have 9 protected European protected plant species and 168 protected plants. Again, really rare habitat, very specific. We're unlikely to encounter them. We have, I think in my career, I've only ever had to work with one, which was the Boston horsetail, which is a Schedule 8 species. So it's illegal to pick, uproot, and disturb. And that plant was actually found on a flood defense scheme, and we had to move it because it was growing, and the flood banks needed to be raised to 6.5 meters. So that required a special license from Natural England because it's highly unlikely you'll ever really have to work on these. But in this case, we did, and we moved the only population that was actually in England at the time. So. And then finally, we have invasive species. There are 30 different species with additional freshwater plants added as a different list. These are illegal to allow to grow or to spread. We'll come on to that a bit when we discuss how this sort of affects you. So, and just to sum up around protected habitats, we have things like internationally important sites, which are designated for habitats. These are the RAMs, the SPAs, the SACs. You have nationally important sites, which are SSSIs, national nature reserves, and ancient woodland. And then you have locally important sites, which are local nature reserves. And the protection for these all sort of comes from a mixture of the SSSI, the Crow Act, and the ARA. Oh, no, darn it. There we are. And the European Protection Law. So let's jump into what does this mean for you? So under the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations and the Wildlife and Countryside Act, it is an offence with certain exemptions to intentionally kill, deliberately capture or harm great crested newts or other European protected species. It's intentionally or recklessly to damage, destroy, and disturb great crested newts or other European protected species when they're using a place of shelter or to obstruct access to that area. It's an offence to damage, destroy breeding sites for newts and bats, water vole and otter, and it's an offence to possess or use any part of great crested newts or to try and sell and barter them. Now, these seem pretty obvious to most people, and you'd think that you wouldn't, as engineers, undertake anything like this. But the key parts of this is the intentionally, but more importantly, the recklessly damage or destroy. So this is where there is sort of a real issue, and you've got the legal definition of reckless, and the definition is a person would be acting recklessly if they could reasonably have been expected to foresee that an operation could cause disturbance or harm to a protected species, but took no action to assess that risk and consider what to do about it. So the key thing here is that if documents are available to you and you don't read them, there could be sufficient grounds for you to have been reasonably expected to foresee that an operation could cause disturbance, and thus you could be considered acting recklessly. Now, as for the causing damage or destruction to resting places or breeding places, even when the animal is not present, it is an offence irrespective of the intent. But disturbance and harm is sort of only considered an offence when it could be caused deliberately. So in the directive, the term sort of deliberate is just interpreted as being somewhat wider than just sort of intentional, and therefore you could be thought of as acting recklessly. And for the next page, I've just sort of highlighted that key sort of part of it. Again, so what does this mean to you? So on your average general site where the planning process has been applied, you're unlikely to encounter legally protected species because as ecologists, we should have already undertaken an ECIA or a PEA of the site, and we would recommend that uh, you ask your clients if an assessment has been undertaken and what was found, and better still if you can see the report. So within these reports, we often provide guidance on sort of vegetation clearance requirements. So it'd be things like remove scrub outside the breeding season. If this isn't possible, a suitably qualified ecologist should undertake an inspection prior to removal of that feature. But we'll also extend to things like earth mounds or rubble features. They need to be taken apart by hand in case there is something in it. So if these documents are available, again, as I said before, and you haven't read them, you could reasonably be considered reckless in your actions. So you should always check to see if those are done. The second point is that if there are protected species on sites, there should be a license, which will have a mitigation strategy. And that will be sort of in place for the works. So if we're moving newts, there'll be a license. I recommend you familiarize yourself with the license, or at least confirm that it is in place, because it is a legal requirement for anyone who's undertaking these actions. And so you should sort of be encouraged just to check the ecologist has a copy with them. It's one of those things we should all carry a copy of the license that we're working under, because if we're challenged, and I've worked on badger sets before where I've had the police come up to me because local residents really don't like it, or they object to a scheme, I can produce the license which says that I am legally allowed to undertake this works because the license grants me that permission. And finally, there may be an exclusion method in place for the duration of the project, something akin to like a reptile fencing that surrounds the entire development, that stops reptiles returning or stops amphibians coming into the works area. And so those things are in place to make sure that impacts aren't sort of experienced. But there are some exceptions. And this is sort of the how not to get arrested part. So the exceptions where you really need to think about your works are where your survey data is sort of over 2 years old. Our data is only considered valid for between, let's say, sort of 12 to 24 months age. And that's because ecology is highly mobile. Things change, stuff moves. If your ecology report is over 2 years old, you really should just be suggesting to your client that they need to think about getting it updated. We've had sites before where we've done inspections for nesting birds, and then 3 weeks later, our client has come back and said, well, you didn't find that nest that we've just found now. And I'm like, well, if you're in the middle of the breeding season, they can move very quickly and they can create something in a matter of days. Badgers are notorious for being able to dig a set within sort of a night if they're determined to. So note about the other part, permitted development, section 278 and section 38 works. Now, the reason these are sort of the risky parts is because none of them require any inputs to the planning portal. So it sometimes assumes that ecology surveys are not required. And they are. You don't need to do a full ECIA, but the minimum a constraint assessment should be required. And this comes back to obviously the NERC Act. It puts an onus on if you're working for government bodies that they undertake certain restrictions or undertake certain actions that are beneficial to offset their impacts. Now, over the past couple of months, we've had quite a few jobs that have sort of assumed, due to short scale time works, sort of under 6 months or less than 10 meters squared, that ecology surveys aren't required. But this is kind of where you most likely to encounter newts during works because there's been no pre-commencement checks. And this type of thing is in excavations near ponds to check for contamination, excavations or vegetation clearance along verge sides, clearing vegetations from spoil piles, moving log piles or earth bunds along railway lines. These are all features that reptiles and GCN will use. And once these features are sort of been left in place, they sort of become habitat, and then removal of those features almost is impossible without a license. So my sort of takeaways from this is that always check that an ecology report has been undertaken, that it's under 2 years old, that you've read the summary or the conclusion. Usually all of our reports have a summary, and it just tells you what needs to be sort of done moving forward. It may require that specific regime of management needs to be undertaken, or that vegetation clearance is needed, or that supervision is needed, and it may even mention that a license is required. And basically, if that is the case, you need to check with your client that the license is in place, to check that you've got that ecologist present for the ecal, or check that that management or clearance has been undertaken. And this is almost sort of double if you're undertaking the permitted development, section 278 and the section 38 works, because there's no planning permission. So people just kind of sometimes forget that. And I'll come on to that with my case study at the end as well. The only final thing is that if you're working on a site and you find a newt, I advise you stop working, take a photo of it. That's really important, and contact your ecologist. I can't stress this enough. You'll see in the case studies that sort of come up that these sort of things happen. But it makes, obviously, if you can provide a photo, it makes it much easier. If it was not intentional, then often, and we sort of cease the action immediately, you can't be classed as reckless. So that's one of the important aspects, is that if you are undertaking the works with an ecologist supervision, and you found a newt and you stop at that point, we essentially did everything we could, and we were completely unexpecting it, then we've acted within the law because we didn't expect to find one, and therefore we're not acting recklessly because we've ceased works once we found one. So a little bit about protected sites. So if your works are going to be taking place near an SPA, an SAC, or a Ramsar, then you'll need a habitat regulations assessment, and that will need to be undertaken. And these sort of come in 4 main stages. Stage 1 is the most common stage, and most stuff can be done under this. It's the screening stage. This is where we demonstrate, or we hopefully demonstrate, that the proposed development will have no significant effects on the features of the SAC, or SPA, or Ramsar. A good example would be if your designated site was susceptible to hydrological changes or pollution, and we demonstrate that through a proposed drainage strategy, there'll be no effects, or we demonstrate through the implementation of a construction environmental management plan that there's no pathways for pollution to reach that site. It can be literally that simple, and that's for things where we're working alongside rivers or areas like that. And a CEMP is a legally required document, and therefore it can be included at stage 1. So ultimately concluding that there's no significant effects means that you can just stop at stage 1. You don't need to proceed to stage 2. If, however, you have some effects and you need to mitigate for it, you must proceed to stage 2. So this is the appropriate assessment stage. It's where you undertake an in-depth analysis of the impact that couldn't be screened out, and you provide mitigation to sort of reduce that impact. Now, I said that the CEMPs, any standard CEMP, can be classed as legally required, and therefore it's not mitigation, and it can be included in stage 1. But if we need something specialist like noise barriers to reduce noise from works, or acoustic or visually screener development, or on one of our sites, we swapped out the yellow high-vis to a darker green high-vis to reduce visual impacts to birds on the shorelines. And this is the type of mitigation that sort of gets included in here. And it equally includes things like phasing your works to avoid winter periods. This is in the case of where you've got like a wintering SPA nearby designated for overwinter birds. So I'd say 90% of our schemes are in stage 1 or 2. I have only ever done in my career one scheme that has progressed past 3 and 4. And stage 3 is the assessment of alternatives. And this is usually big schemes of what can you do differently, and can we completely avoid having the impact at all. So you need to look at all various alternatives. For our scheme, we were doing an abstraction project for an entire county, and we had to assess alternatives of pumping water in from the other counties or tankering water in, and ultimately they were unsuccessful. They couldn't deliver the amount of water, and they just shifted the problem. And so we had to proceed to stage 4, which is the IROPI stage. Now that stands for sort of imperative reasons of overriding public interest. And so we have to demonstrate that whatever impact we're having, the value to the public is sort of greater than that, and it's in the public's interest that it goes ahead. But there is also a big part of compensation that needs to then be delivered to try and best offset that impact, and that can get sort of quite costly. Now, you might have heard about the people over wind ruling, which sort of came about sort of about 2 years ago now, and this was following a big trial in the European Court where implementation of mitigation had been originally part of stage 1, where people were including mitigation, but it often led to them screening out impacts further down the line. So at that point, it meant that you can no longer undertake a stage 1 assessment under the people over wind by including mitigation in that, and that it all has to be included in stage 2. Which is why a lot more schemes now start proceeding to the appropriate assessment. But the caveat was that obviously anything that is legally required can be included at stage 1. So for things like national sites, SSIs and national nature reserves, usually under the Wildlife and Countryside Act and CRO assessment, we just need to undertake a specific assessment based sort of on what impacts will be forecast to the site. It's not like a HRA, which is a legally sort of binding document. What you outline in a HRA, you have to commit to, including the work schemes. So if we're saying we're going to be done within a year, you have to be done within a year, or we need to extend or re-amend the HRA. So when we're doing SSIs and national nature reserves, we have to do an assessment of our impacts. But where we're working on SSIs, we specifically then have to apply a CRO assessment and get confirmation from Natural England that they're accepting of whatever works we're going to be doing. And this is where we end up checking that conditions tracker on what conditions you're allowed to undertake on site. But nearly all of them, again, require that breaking ground, some sort of vegetation cutting or compressing ground, all trigger a requirement of consultation with them. Now, finally, we have local protected sites. The legal requirement to protect local sites is more planning policy than any sort of legal documentation, usually through a local plan that they afford protection to them. And usually we just have to provide some sort of assessment based on what's going to sort of be done to that. And then finally, we have non-statutory sites. So these don't have any legal requirement, but they're usually sort of covered through a little bit of planning policy and sometimes just through the support of local residents, like county wildlife sites, local wildlife sites, and sites of important nature conservation. So you can pick these up on a magic map to sort of have a search. And usually they're sort of managed by wildlife trusts, and they will object to developments if the works aren't assessed properly. So you do need to take them into account, but they're usually addressed within your ECIA or an ES chapter separately rather than in their own individual report. So zones of influence. So what do you need to consider as a sort of site? So a general rule of thumb is a quick check of the site or if your works area. So to have a check within 2K for SSIs and within 10K for SPAs and SACs. And that's what an ecologist would do. And but there are a lot of counties that are proceeding with a more joined up approach on impacts. And through sort of visitor monitoring programs on sites have come up with impact zones. So Essex has the Essex RAMs, Suffolk has the recreation avoidance and mitigation strategies, and these set zones of impact for what they consider to be for those sites. So for a lot of these sites in Essex, it's a 22-kilometre zone of impact. For recreation, which means that any resi development that is likely to increase recreation on those sites needs to assess impacts to them. Suffolk sets that at 13 kilometres, but it splits it between two zones, with one zone being more high risk than the other. And the zones demand a payment as well as mitigation through your scheme. Now, this doesn't seem that it affects you guys, But recently, Epping Forest assessed the impacts based on a 2 kilometre recreational impact zone of the forest, but it was challenged in the court because they didn't effectively look at the impacts of air quality. And only recently, well, for a period since 2019, the forest has been the council has been unable to grant any planning application for any development within 2 kilometres of the forest that increases air quality impacts upon the forest. Now, they've only recently just been able to publish a documentation with Natural England support that shows the measures that they're going to be undertaking to offset impacts within the forest, as well as moving towards a more better air quality situation. But for a while, it was things they were almost potentially implementing congestion charging around the forest as a means of reducing the air quality impacts that were happening to the site. So a lot of this is sort of quite alien to you guys, possibly. But the reality is, unless you're undertaking permitted development works inside one of these areas or in close proximity, there should have been a check by an ecologist or the client. And if you're working within a triple SI, you need to ask for a copy of that assent, because Natural England will assess your impacts through the CRO assessment and grant assent for your works. And that way, if you've got confirmation that the HRA is in place and you've got confirmation that you have assent, you can crack on with your works and you won't be considered reckless. So on one of my sites, we had a sluice gate that the EA hadn't been maintaining, and the farmer was frustrated by it because he kept flooding his land. So he got a professional company to come out and dig out the sluice to drain his land. Now, they undertook the works within an SPA, an SAC, and a triple SI, and it was seen by someone from an adjacent footpath. Now, because the contractor didn't ask if an assessment had been done, and because the farmer hadn't done an assessment, they were both ultimately found to be reckless in their actions, and both the contractor and the farmer were fined £40,000. Now, my example with this is that whilst we at Sweco, we have a thing called Fika at lunch, which is about coffee and cake, two very good things. And everyone meets in sort of the canteen and when we discuss things. And whilst I was talking to an engineer on our lunch break, we were talking about a site in Boston where we were sort of raising flood defences over 6 kilometres and the need for a HRA to cover the works because they were taking place within the SPA and because they were taking place in close proximity. Now, for this particular scheme, we were going to be doing piling, and it was going to be on the shoreline. So it was going to be loud and noisy, and it was going to be impacting vast numbers of birds. So we got to talking, and I discovered through chatting with our engineering friend that there were things such as a Geiken silent piling rig. So we ended up implementing the silent piling rig, and through monitoring on site, we found that it led to a significant reduction in potential impacts, and is a fantastic example that I like to throw in of how we can reduce impacts by sort of communicating and discussion with each other. So still on this sort of same sort of conversation with the said same engineer, and this is my nice little case study here, we have the Neen washes. So whilst I was talking to him, he said to me, I've got a site that's in the middle of the Neen washes that gas company thinks there is a damage to the one of the gas pipes that runs under the site. And I wanted to, and I thought we're fine to go on. We need to do some engineering works on the bridge to confirm it can support the required plant that we need to get over, and we'll be using Kangol hammers to break open the concrete and sort of look at it. So at that point, I sort of said to him, "What sort of assessments have you sort of done?" And he sort of mistakenly believed that because his works were small scale and temporary, and that they were under permitted development, that no assessment was required. And so we instantly sort of shot this down. This was not the case. We need a constraints assessment. which he subsequently commissioned. And it was sort of at that point we found that there would not just be works nearby, but we would be working completely inside the SPA, the SSI, and the Ramsar. And that the client obviously wanted to commission the structural investigation works to the bridge within the week. So again, with short term, we've reviewed the types of impact. We reviewed the timing of the works. We drafted a HRA to sort of show that despite they were using loud hammers to break open the concrete, it was at a period of time when a lot of the wintering assemblage were gone and it was just breeding assemblage present. We did a site visit to confirm that the breeding assemblage being Garnaghy and some rarer ducks were unlikely to use the area around the bridge. But we could demonstrate that at least the the investigation works could proceed. We sort of then led on to delivering another HRA to cover the main aspect of the site, which was the digging up of the pipe, the excavation, and that led to sort of restrictions on when we could undertake the works. We got our Crow assessment done so that we could get a scent for working in the SSI, and thereby sort of allow us to proceed without breaking the law. And during the process, we sort of had to liaise constantly with Natural England via discretionary advice to finish the HRA and ensure that the works proceeded sort of legally. And this is just one of my examples that really sort of hit home, where it hadn't been considered, and had we gone ahead with this, we could have been potentially working illegally. And all it takes is that sort of one person who's walking his dog that perhaps sees you, or the local farmer who doesn't like what you're doing, to report it, and all of a sudden you can find yourself under a serious fine. And the nature of a lot of the new wildlife fines mean that now no longer are they just sort of fixed fines, they're proportionate to the amount that the individual stood to gain from the action. So one of the recent cases down in sort of Southampton saw a developer sell his site to another developer. He passed on the ecology reports. The developer didn't read them, commissioned a land clearance crew to remove a hedgerow. The hedgerow was removed, and then they found that dormouse had been present. They were identified in the early ecology reports, and that the hedgerow had basically been destroyed by this point. So when that happened, the developer was fined £120,000. He was forced to reinstate the hedgerow, and the arboriculturalist who undertook the removal were also fined £46,000. And that prevented him from developing the rest of the site. So they were only able to part develop the site because they weren't going to be granted a license to undertake any other hedgerow removal. Right. I've sort of nattered on for quite a long period of time. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Joshua, for that presentation. And I've got a few questions that just arose from your presentation. And you mentioned about licenses and the importance that you have a license before you undertake that work. So ultimately, who has to hold that license? Is it the client that needs to hold that license, or the contractor, or is there a principal designer who needs to hold that license? I mean, who is the person that takes responsibility for that?
So when we apply for a license, they want your client's details and the ecologist who is handling it. So the license is written so that, because we have to list everyone who'll be working on the license, and those people are then allowed to undertake the action that would be considered usually illegal without the presence of a license. So usually you have your ecology consultant and your client should be CC'd into everything and hold the license. The ecologist will bring a copy with them because they're working under it, but it ultimately is the client's responsibility.
So the client then appoints a contractor to go along and do some digging near a hedgerow to lay some drains. Is that under a license?
If that hedgerow was found to have dormouse present within it,
Yeah.
and you were going to be cutting through the hedgerow, it may need to be under a license.
If
If
you're
you
going to be
were
digging beside it, not
if you're
cutting
going to be
through it.
digging beside it and you're not cutting through it, then you could potentially get away with a precautionary method statement so that your actions were undertaken, sort of vegetation clearance was undertaken to ensure that there were no dormouse present, and therefore you're unlikely to impact dormouse because they're not in the area that you're working. You could potentially disturb them, but the likelihood of your works doing that, um, obviously for your trenching or ditching like that, it's short-term works. Um,
Yeah.
but equally,
Yeah.
it would be best to check your historic. So we do like a data search to confirm what was present in the area, so we'd know whether or not you've got records of dormouse being present in the first place.
So that again comes back to that anything over 2 years, review and redo
Yes.
again. Yeah. And then the next one is your presentation was primarily about main scale construction and development. Um, what if there was a situation where a client wanted to have an extension done to their house, and 2 doors down there was a pond which belonged to their neighbouring property, which they were completely unaware of. And off they go, digging, 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 and all of a sudden, one of your wonderful creatures of God came running out, a crested newt. Um, but they weren't aware of it. Do they have to then stop and get reports done, or
They
because it
should.
happens to be? But they weren't. It's a domestic house. They're digging away. They had no idea that there was a pond. Are they in trouble? Are they at risk of being fined?
So technically, there has never really been a fine of small housing developments like that, and I see posts of it on my face on our local village Facebook group. I just found a newt in my house and
I'd
things like
keep
that all
quiet.
the time. Um, that's ultimately the thing is that because there is no a lot of these extensions are done without an ecology survey or anything like that. That there's no means for them to really know, and in that sense, it's not a requirement of them by the council to undertake a survey. Although some extensions of listed buildings require bat surveys, depending on your
Yeah,
council, because they
yeah,
obviously know. Um, so in theory, you should stop and you should apply for a license. Um, Natural England's DLL, particularly for newts, does offer a small scheme version for the individual developer or the sort of the lone person putting in a small sort of extension as well. But I think it gets missed a lot more
okay.
than people
So,
realise.
it's important then, just from the presentation that you've offered, that it is not just for large sites on greenbelt land, on greenland. I note that there's an exemption on brownfield sites. Um, yeah,
For
so you
for
wouldn't.
yeah, for some of the stuff around the biodiversity net gain, there is an exemption on brownfield sites.
Yeah,
Um, if you still like, I mean, brownfield sites happen to be sometimes some of the best for reptiles and things, and so wildlife law will still come into place around that. It's just that you don't always have to try and achieve such high as
high
the 10% net gain.
cases.
In
Okay,
some
fine.
schemes that we're running, we're able to achieve a 50% loss, but a 10%, we have to achieve a 50% loss, but a 10% gain on whatever we've lost, a
I
minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one is the bit about you having to use 10% of the lost area somewhere else.
Yeah.
I struggle to find how you do that on a brownfield site, because everywhere else you're looking is all built up. So but I do appreciate that on sites that you're building on virgin ground, and potentially, yes, you need to offload and move the diversity to another part of an area that isn't affected by the construction. But
Well,
from
some of
what
our
you're,
sites in London, you can achieve serious gains because there's so little on site to begin with. So we have some developments that are achieving 300, 400% net gain by putting in a brown roof or a green roof when there was nothing there to begin with. just because it's the way the calculator works.
And who and in London, which species would that benefit?
Well, surprisingly, there's a lot in London. So we predominantly recommend things like brown roofs, which can be used with solar panels as they create microclimates. So it's a nutrient poor habitat mimics wasteland, and you'll get a lot of bat species feeding over it because it's usually high in invertebrates. You've got the rarer species like black redstart, which like to feed on them, and they're also sort of form a nice nesting substrate for things like peregrine. So for some of the sky towers that we've done at sort of 8 to sort of 16 stories, that becomes quite a nice habitat for things like the peregrine and some of the birds. But equally, we've done some schemes where we've put bee boxes and even beehives on roofs at sort of 12 stories and sort of higher. And there's a great invertebrate population in sort of London and a number of bee lines that these sort of various invertebrate groups will sort of like bug life will point out to you.
Oh, I did not know that at all. I did not know that at all. Well, that's something that's, I think, worthwhile. But I mean, I found your presentation extremely informative as always, and I point out that I do know that March is a time when ecologists literally come to life with good advice to those who may fall foul of legislative law if they undertake to do work that is not in keeping with legislation. So really, Joshua, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that the slides will be offered to the members, but on behalf of the Chartered Association, I'd like to again just thank you for offering us this presentation. There are no comments made, so I'm taking that at 5:15 to be the end. And so I'd like to close the session. For those members of the Southern region, our next event is a face-to-face conference in Maidstone on the 14th of March. It'll be the CPD technical conference is between 3 p.m. until 7. So there will be details will be uploaded onto the website. But the date for your diary is the 14th of March, which is the next face-to-face technical regional conference. So with all that to do, I wish you all a good evening and a safe working week forward. Thank you very much. Goodbye.